Hi everyone, welcome to our research design lectures which form a part of our international relations lecture series. This lecture is the continuation of the last research design lecture in which I had discussed about the quantitative research design using an example. As you could see, the research design in quantitative method is about making a causal relationship model. It is a strictly systematic methodology where the researchers must proceed with required mathematical steps and then interpret the results accordingly. But when we talk about qualitative method, I would put that the research design is completely different. I mean, you can definitely talk about some causal relationship between variables even in your textual or qualitative research paper, or I mean, you can see that scholars also borrow quantitative terms in order to show that the paper follows a certain logical systematic procedure. But the way you go about to explain is completely different. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the paper by Jeffrey Checkel, University of Constance, Germany. The title of the paper is International Norms and Domestic Politics, Bridging the Rationalist Constructivist Divide, published in the European Journal of International Relations in the year 1997. Please note that although this article deals with a theoretical debate in I mean international relations, our objective is not to review and examine the theoretical content, rather to learn how this paper is modeled, structured, how the cases are analyzed as we did in the last article. Nevertheless, I'll give you some brief context about this theoretical debate so that those of you who are not familiar with IR theoretical debates will find it quite useful in order to understand this article. And those who belong to IR scholarship, they will refresh their knowledge. You see, IR is a scholarship that seeks to understand and explain behavior of states, I mean countries, in this so-called global system. Therefore, IR scholars have tried to do that with the help of certain theories. So as a result, different scholars have had different voices on how the political world works or the social world works, how states behave and why. Uh, Traditionally, I mean, the realist theorists have dominated the scholarship. There are realist theorists, there are liberals, and now there are constructivist theorists and some other theorists. So the scholarship that was dominated by realists put most emphasis on economic and military power of states, security matters, and they understand that all these hard power factors constitute states' interest. But lately, the constructivist school established their own arguments that norms, right, something called norms like democracy, human rights, international rules from the UN or other international organizations play a significant role in the constitution of a state's interest and behavior. Uh, Even other schools accepted this argument that something called norms do matter. But the question is how they do matter, how they matter. All right. So liberals or regime schools, who largely fall into the realist camp, believe that norms are used as constraints. But constructivists say that norms are not constrained, but they constitute identity and interest. So therefore, states learn from those norms and they move on with the new image. So among several debates in IR, one big debate is rationalism versus constructivism. Okay, those liberals and regime school I was talking about, they follow rationalist method. Just to put it simply, just think of economics, where actors behave to maximize their profit. So that's rationalism. Uh, Constructivism, it's more of a cognitive factor where actors learn new norms and values and they change their preferences. So this is these are basically two methodologies: rationalism versus constructivism. They are in fact not theories but approaches, or the meta theoretical standpoint, if you like. Here for this article, just remember two terms like norms constrain and norms constitute. The rationalism assumes that norms constrain, that because of norms, states or any actors are not allowed to do few things, but constructivism assumes that norms constitute. So it's not about constraining you, but about teaching you. I mean, you learn from norms and then you change your preferences itself. And in terms of this specific article we have here, it's about the European human rights regime under the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, and how some European countries have behaved vis-a-vis this European human rights regime. All right, as always, before examining the article section by section, I'll summarize you the article for you so that it will be easier to understand. So the author Jeffrey Checkle picks up from that point of debate where constructivists and rationalists are adamantly advocating their own approaches. He suggests a middle path. He recommends a certain so-called, within quotes, scope conditions which take both the standpoints that norms constitute and norms constrain as well. Therefore, to show his point, he studies how the European human rights rules, as I said earlier, under the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, has made it through to certain countries or not made it through. So what the countries he studies are Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and also as an extra case he brought in Great Britain. So Checkle evaluates the European policy accepting process, or as this study puts it, the norms diffusion, by examining the citizenship and minority rights rules or norms. So his method is both textual and discursive. Textual meaning both reading documents, treaty drafts, conventions, and discursive is interviewing relevant experts or staffs of the Council of Europe and other relevant individuals from those studied countries. So what the author does is to evaluate how this process has happened. Has it happened by learning and changing your preferences, or it has happened by succumbing to pressure? To be more specific, by elite learning, the politicians and decision makers have learned new norms and values and then they applied them, or there was huge pressure from the social groups and they succumb to that pressure. So by his methods, which is reading and talking to people by using his head, there is no statistical analysis unlike the quantitative papers. He determines a certain pattern. All right, he makes out a certain pattern. So he finds that in some cases there is elite learning and in some cases there is societal pressure, and for instance in case of Germany there are both. So therefore he shows that both rationalists and constructivists are right. So let's move into the main body of the article. As always, the introduction, even though the article doesn't explicitly put it as introduction, it's more of a research problem. So here he gives the context, what this study is all about, all right? The existence, the raison d'etre. So then he starts with a research problem. So what is the research problem here? As I said earlier, the scholars of both schools, rationalist and constructivist, are only going their ways and not thinking of reconciling and synthesizing their insights. Therefore, he talks about his approach, which is problem driven as opposed to method driven. Meaning, he is not adhering to any particular method, but looking into the international norms and domestic politics issue the way they are, all right, the way they work. And then, as usual, in this section, the author gives us the signposts, like tell us how this article is structured for the readers to have an idea about how to read through it. And in the next section, he elaborates on the issue of norms. Sort of, he briefly reviews the literature, then again repeats his case that the two schools not coming together, right? So I'll just pick up a statement from here, what he says from the article. Cross-national studies, the quantitative ones, the norm diffusion offer little insight as they are quantitative and correlational in design. Missing is the detailed process tracing and case research needed to explore actual diffusion mechanisms. So compare this statement to the last paper we discussed. There, those quantitative authors just said the opposite. Right? So this is how you sort of justify the existence of your paper. Why you need this method, all right? So what new insight you could bring to the literature. So that's the point. So all right. So coming back to our point, in the third section, the author thoroughly explained about these hypotheses. He puts it as predictions here. And his analytical model, and then how he is measuring what he is arguing, and how he is in fact defining what norm says. So what we're going to do right now is discuss all of them in the following. So the author has proceeded here in several steps. For instance, he's talking about norms, European human rights norms in particular. Therefore, first he had to show what norms are and where are they. Okay. So how he is going to convince others that European level norm is there. Then, why Europe? Why he had chosen Europe? Why European study is apt to show about norms effect, international norms effect on domestic politics. So he had to justify all of that. And how his research design differs from other available studies so that the debate goes further, right? So what he figures out is, while talking about international and national policy links, there is another level which is the domestic settings, right? So therefore, as an analytical tool, the author brings domestic structure, different character of domestic politics as an intervening variable. Now you hear another new term, intervening variable, which is between independent and dependent variable. And the independent variable needs intervening variable to, in order to give its effect, send its effect through to the dependent variable. Because between international norms and norms acceptance and implementation, there is the domestic settings. Whether it is the liberal or non-liberal settings, definitely that makes a difference as well in terms of the norms diffusion or acceptance. So furthermore, he distinguishes the mechanism of norms trajectory. One is the the elite learning, and another is the societal pressure, which I mentioned in the summary. Just one note here. I'm using simply the term norms acceptance in order to not to create any confusion, right? But in fact, in the literature, you'll find terms such as norms diffusion, or this paper uses norms empowerment, and rationalists call it compliance, constructivists call it internalization of norms, and all that. Okay. So This study is basically modeled on the basis of this empowerment argument. So, empowerment process here, the author means a clear pathway how an international norms makes through to domestic politics. Other past studies used, according to him, some vague explanations about transmission mechanism or spread mechanism, but exactly these studies do not show us any particular path, exact mechanism how they are working. In fact, right? So what he does, he borrows the insights from public policy literature and categorizes domestic politics of these four countries into four types. I mean, not only these four countries, he distinguishes the domestic settings into four types: liberal, corporatist, statist, and state above society. So he defines codes as he puts it as coding as in the quantitative analysis. Germany as corporatist, meaning a top-down approach. Elites decide. However, society matters first in corporatist society, right? And then secondary are the elites. Then he quotes Ukraine as state above society, where society does not matter much. It is just the elites. And there is a passive attitude towards reforms. And Russia, he defines it as statist. Although in Russia, Russian Federation, some societal level associations exist, they do not work properly. So basically, centralized political elites rule. And then the extra case here is Britain, Great Britain, which the author takes as an extra case, as I said, is defined as liberal rule in which individuals and society matter. So now what he does, how to justify these domestic structures coding, I mean how they are relevant to this study. So the author draws some analogy, all right? He gives us some past incidents. For instance, in terms of the liberal structure in the US during the Clinton administration, uh, when there was the issue of the international child sweatshop, how the international organizations, human rights organizations, created a tremendous pressure, and then as a result, Clinton administration had to change its policy. Uh, and in terms of state above society, he talks about the USSR at the end of the Cold War, how the elite learning had changed. The Gorbachev, right, the leader Gorbachev, how he got this normative understanding, changing normative understanding of security and politics. Similarly, in terms of the corporate structure, he puts it, it's sort of a more complex mechanism. Both mechanisms, both elite learning and liberal societal mechanisms are in play here. Okay, state decision makers play greater role than liberal case in normative scenes, but they do not impose their decision on society, which he calls the hallmark, as several scholars put it as a hallmark of corporatism in connecting state and society. So you mean society still has important role here, you see. So both societal pressure and any learning lead to norm empowerment. Okay, so the example he gives is the of Germany at that period in the 1990s, with the ongoing European norms on citizenship were being empowered in the Federal Republic of Germany. And the another one is the statist structure, which is learning by elite, okay, the decision makers. That plays much dominant role in the process of global norms reaching domestic agenda. In such regime, societal organizations are weaker than the liberal or corporatist types. For instance, France in 1995, when the Greenpeace International, which invoked environmental norms, and engineered an international and domestic pressure campaign failed to stop French nuclear tests in the South Pacific. So this is how he has explained what are his tools here, why these domestic settings have been necessary to understand the variation between these different domestic settings. So then he talks about norms, its existence, its content. He shows first that norms exist because while talking to people around, he noted that there is a sort of an intersubjective understanding about European norms in Europe. And he also, I mean, did some comparisons between the human rights conventions from the 1990s with its predecessor, 1963 predecessor documents, and he figures out there are some significant changes because the documents in the 1990 have put the individuals sort of they place them above countries. So that's why in terms of having multiple citizenship or dual citizenship, there were no issues of divided loyalty and so on, right? And he justifies the the case is the region. Why Europe? European human rights framework under the Strasbourg-based Council of Europe was, I mean, is international regimes in operation, robust international regime norms. And many scholars argued that the post-Cold War network of active international institutions in Europe made it a likely setting for norm influence on state policy. All right, so this in fact justify why it's Europe. So with this analytical tool, what are the findings? It's mixed. In Ukraine, against the expectation of some other scholars, he found that there is elite learning. All right, so they have sort of applied those norms according to, I mean, through the elite learning. And in terms of Germany, there were both the elite's decision making and there is learning and pressure from the societal groups, right? In terms of Russia, it didn't happen, all right, because it was basically statist, and there were no, in fact, even scope for other organizations to do anything. And so in terms of Russia, it is necessary, as the author argues, the domestic agency. Why some norms are diffused and why not? It would be necessary in order to understand that in terms of Russia. And in terms of Britain, he finds that there is a societal press. Even if the political elites were not happy, they were succumb to the pressure of the international organization. So this is it was the societal pressure. So as you can see, his findings is basically both constructivist and rationalists are right. Sometimes they constitute and sometimes they constrain. So this is basically these are the findings or the case studies are explained very well in very accessible way, so you yourself can read them. It's not a problem. But an important note I want to give you: one might think that qualitative papers are about normative issues like what ought to be, what should be, but not empirical. That is what it is. But this article is a very good example. This, even if it is qualitative, it's empirical in its research. It's scientific because the article follows a series of logical steps that reduce researchers' personal values and beliefs. So, on this note, I end this part of the lecture. Thank you.